there's a reason why I call it neo-populism at the moment, because we are witnessing a new wave of populism, which has certainly began with the financial crisis, and those two parties, the Five Star Movement and the League, which actually in the 90s used to be called the Northern League, now it's no longer the Northern League but the League, have witnessed a significant electoral boost after the financial crisis and after the refugee or immigration crisis as well. And for this reason, I decided to apply Paul Taggart's concept to see Paul Taggart's concept of Heartland, which is a way of studying populism that goes perhaps, I would say, beyond the three common approaches in the studies of populism, which is the ideational one, the socio-cultural approach, and the political strategic approach. And what I have done in my paper is I look at how the Heartland is constructed within the discursive patterns of those two neo-populist actors. The Five Star Movement is a little bit of background I'm going to give here. The Five Star Movement is a populist party that is often associated with the left on the political spectrum, although that's very debatable, however, more commonly associated with the left, while the League is certainly a typical anti-immigrationist, anti-globalist populist party. And it's interesting to see how these two parties frame their social reality and how they envision this heartland in their forms of monologue, in their discursive patterns. I'll explain that in more detail whilst I move forward. However, I should probably say that Paul Taggart is an expert in the field of British expert in the field of populism, and he gives this new definition to sort of he approaches populism with this concept of heartland. Most populist parties and movements envision a heartland. And a heartland is essentially a political imaginary that certainly resides in populist ideology and discourse. It's a version, Paul Taggart defines it as a version of the past that celebrates a hypothetical, uncomplicated, and non-political territory of imagination. So you might ask yourself why I have adopted Paul Taggart's theoretical framework to approach populist discourse and populist monologue. Well, applying Paul Taggart's Heartland to different leaders and different parties allows us to build on an efficient comprehension of specific uses of populist monologue and dialogue, their discursive styles, and their political narratives, of course. It allows us to see the commonality across different manifestations of populism. The study of populism is essential at the moment because we live in a time where we are witnessing a rise of what I call national populism, which is actually the populism of the right-wing populism. A famous academic called Matthew Goodwin says it is actually not a passing phase. It doesn't appear to be going away anytime soon. And an example of this would be, for example, the fact that even though Donald Trump has been defeated in the US, there are more than 70 million people that have still voted for this sort of Trumpism. This neo-populism is what it is. And parties that are considered to be ideologically populist or use discursive, performative populist strategies and hold the majoritarian view of democracy, which is direct, participative, are on the rise in several countries. In Italy, we have, of course, seen those two populist parties, League and Five Star Movement, come together to form a government in 2018. It was a brief experience. And we see in other countries such as Austria, The Freedom Party is quite successful. In Hungary, of course, we have Orban. In Poland, we have the Law and Justice Party. And in India, we have Modi, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and of course, Donald Trump in the United States. Therefore, it is essential to understand how neo-populists frame their social reality within their monologues and recognize whether their attitudes towards democratic systems are a threat or not a threat. Ultimately, it is important to understand whether those with a proclivity for Western classic democratic liberalism can, not just Western, but can engage with these populist actors. And for this reason, towards the end of my paper for the Dialogue Society, I also discuss whether dialogue with neo-populists is possible and desirable. Now, going back to the heartland concept, Trump has, I will give the Trump example because it's one of the clearest ones, with his famous slogan, "Make America Great Again," has implicitly called for a return to what I would say is a heartland, to which Taggart argues is essentially an idolization or glorification of a past society. It is irrelevant whether the heartland has existed or not, but what matters in the populist narrative is the nostalgic idea of homogeneity and of comfort. This can also be somewhat tied to some nationalist and far right, but not only far right, panegyric redemption narratives. And it is not a coincidence, in fact, that Trump tells his supporters that America can be great again, in the sense that it has already been great, and with populist policies, we can return to this greatness in their perspective. Of course, right-wing populists like those from the League believe that with their involvement, the nation can return to be a more safe, ethno-culturally homogeneous, stable, hardworking, and producerist society. But it is also interesting to see if the heartland can be related to left-wing populists, like the Five Star Movement, who also call for a crypto-utopic society where they pressure elites to be more virtuous, to be more honest in their practice of politics, to be more transparent. And they argue that through the digital web and through direct democracy practices, this can be accomplished. Those are essentially the values of the monolithic heartland. Of course, because I wrote this piece for the Dialogue Society, I did also want to link the heartland to Ronald C. ARNETT's concept of monologue and dialogue. Authors like ARNETT or Adam Ferguson, although much earlier, have focused on the dialogic possibility between people who have their own political agendas and petite narratives. Keeping in mind that, of course, the populist heartland functions in many ways as a petite narrative, because it's a narrative of attachment to local soil, to a broader localist tradition, and to community, to nation statism, to a form of territorial, economic, and popular sovereignism. Their speeches at rallies, their monologues in parliament, where they attack the political establishment and provide a critique of globalization and call for a reform of the democratic system, is a form of monologue. They come in form of monologic confessions or monologic expressions, and where in fact many of the values of the heartland, such as honesty, transparency, homogeneity, definitely transpire. And since ARNETT argues that monologue is the fulcrum point of dialogue, I stress that sometimes, whether we like it or not, we have to hear these positions, and we have to hear these petite narratives to at least attempt to establish a bridge, and perhaps that's where dialogue can commence. Uh, Moving on, so I argue towards the end of my paper that uh, communicative agents embedded with populist ideology and who envision heartlands, um, it's essential to actually try and have a dialogue with these actors, because, as ARNETT says, dialogue begins with acknowledgement rather than approval, and must inevitably commence with giving space to monologues. And in this case, in my case, I look at the monologues of the League and the Five Star Movement, the monologues of Beppe Grillo, the leader of the Five Star, and or Matteo Salvini, the leader of the League. So we live in a world where, because we live in a world where that is incredibly polarized. I don't think there are any arguments against that, especially in politics, where there are two clashing worldviews that have come forward. One of them strictly ideologically liberal, democratic, cosmopolitan, internationalist, and progressive. On the other side, we also have a revival of a more traditionalist and an ideology that embodies this attachment to territory, the nation state, to authority, to popular sovereignty. And in a future where this cleavage is likely to remain, we must learn to attempt to create a dialogic possibility between the two. I'm not going to go into great detail about my specific definition of populism. There are many definitions out there, but feel free later to ask me if there is something you would like to know in more detail. I define populism as a polymorphous ideology. It doesn't have a clear structure or form, but it does have an anti-elitist ethos. So it is a polymorphous ideology with an anti-elitist ethos that heavily relies on antagonistic discourse to get its message across to its potential supporters and to its perennial opponents. So the reality seems to be that dialogue can only occur if one is willing to acknowledge populist monologic confessions by keeping in mind some of the non-negotiable terms of modern populists that seem to be evident after a theoretical exploration of Taggart's Heartlands concept that I have carried out. One of them is certainly that even if the territory, the heartland is a territory of imagination, it is fundamental because it is fundamental because it is constructed through the collective consciousness of the people. And we know that populism is an extremely at least it claims to be an extremely people-centric ideology. The heartland is an unpoliticized space where a community, within the petite narrative of populism, where a community functions due to its inhabitants' successful use of common sense, which is sufficient to resolve day-to-day problematics, given it is a place of great homogeneity, civic, cultural, or ethnic, where there are these civic or cultural or ethnic bonds. For this reason, we often hear populists attack transnational institutions like the European Union or NATO, the World Health Organization, because they see these actors as alien to the heartland. They see technocratic politics as alien to the populist heartland. They, according to them, it seems like these actors have no place in a homogeneous and conflict-ridden society, which is quite utopic from their perspective, but which they prefer compared to the sort of postmodern liberal democracy that they have trouble with understanding. Um, Moving on, also, it is clear that in a populist vision, a heartland is a producerist community of hardworking persons defined by labor and shared sacrifice. The heartland should and will be defended by intruders and outsiders who interfere with its economic, popular, and territorial sovereignty, as well as its general well-being. And this is why I would mention perennial opponents who are alien to the populist vision. So, however, we have to ask ourselves whether these petite narratives could open up a dialogic possibility. Um, Perhaps it is time to acknowledge, rather not approve, but acknowledge that there are significant electoral blocks, more than 70 million that voted for Trump in the US, the many millions that casted their vote for the Italian populists in 2018 and in 2013. In France, the Front National, now Rassemblement National, has seen a rise in electoral success. So, yes. Oh, is that how much time I've got left? Oh, okay. Okay, I should probably then just wrap it up and say that I have used discourse analysis and theoretical explanation as my methodology. I'll go straight to my last slide. Sorry about the timing. Is dialogue with neo-populists possible? I believe that Jean Werner Müller's approach is right to this question, that we can only engage with mature forms of populism. And it's right. And Müller says, for example, that when populists claim that they and only they represent the will of the people, the volonté générale, and delegitimize their political competitors for being corrupt and immoral a priori before a discussion, before a dialogue, then no further engagement is possible. And this sometimes happens, it doesn't always happen. And of course, ARNETT reminds us that dialogue is not possible with everyone. That being said, I'll just conclude by saying that a good way to approach a possible future dialogue is to recognize that yes, the attachment to the two pillars of liberal democracy that populists emphasize, which is the Republican principle and the majoritarian principle, where electoral majorities have the right to form government and create policies, and the peoples and states are sovereign. However, they must also be reminded for a future dialogic possibility to occur, that those are not the only key tenets of democracy. We also have to consider the rule of law, constitutionalism, and liberalism, of course, which means individual rights, freedoms, minority rights, human rights, etc. So let us just think, perhaps let us just perhaps finish with the idea that a populist narrative, a populist petite narrative, could in a way serve as could be a dwelling from which other political guests can be welcomed into the possibility of a future dialogue. Thank you very much.